In the USA, some of the world's most dangerous individuals are locked behind bars. A prison in Minnesota housed one of the most depraved murderers, known by inmates as the family killer.
Craig Bjork is probably one of the most dangerous prisoners in the country. He seems to have a trail of dead bodies behind him.
The murder case has been in newspapers, on radio, and television. There are few people who haven't heard of the case. 4 strangled bodies were found.
Bjork, the serial killer, didn't hesitate in strangling his own flesh and blood.
I mean, how anybody can kill your own kids? He should have been put to death a long time ago.
Murdering anybody, of course, is inexcusable. Murdering your children, well, you get a special spot in hell for that.
Newspaper articles at the time really painted a picture of sort of like a Hannibal Lecter figure. You looked into his eyes and there was just like no recognition of a person there.
Even within the prison system, Bjork's lust for killing showed no sign of abating.
Craig Bjork grabbed a 3-foot pipe, proceeded to hit Edwin Curry in the head, maybe up to 8 times. He was basically a sick individual, and he was proud of it, I think.
The guard testified later that he started telling him, hey, it's a good thing you caught me when you did, because I was going to kill a bunch more people.
This is not just your typical inmate. This is an absolutely depraved, psychopathic, evil, remorseless human being.
Oak Park Heights is Minnesota's only maximum security prison and can house up to 473 criminals.
This is where they put the worst of the worst prisoners. I've toured it several times. There's solitary confinement units where you can't hear anything except for your own breath.
At Oak Park Heights, I was bit. I've had feces thrown on me. I've had urine thrown on me. I was almost stabbed by a federal inmate. My name is Dave Campa. I spent 35 years as a correctional officer and a special investigator. Oak Park Heights Prison, when it was built in 1982, it was the supermax of Minnesota. It's basically 4 stories underground, built into a hill to make sure that nobody can escape from it.
On most any given day that I was in prison, there were some kinds of assaults. It could be everything from just a good knock across the head to being a full-fledged killing. If we went a couple of days and nobody had done anything, then you start worrying. You start thinking somebody's planning something.
One of its most notorious inmates was convicted serial killer Craig Bjork.
There was this question of, what do we do with this prisoner who keeps killing people after he's been incarcerated? I don't think that most prisons have the tools to deal with someone like Craig Bjork.
Bjork displayed quite a few psychopathic traits. He displayed lack of empathy. He displayed impulsivity. He displayed criminal versatility, pathological lying.
Yes, he would probably be the most dangerous person that I have ever dealt with.
His cold-blooded murders stretch over 4 decades.
To call him evil is an understatement. He is the rawest form of evil.
He almost looks like a demon. He's a very evil man, and how somebody could kill somebody like that, majority of people can't fathom that.
I believe without a doubt that if Bjork was released from prison, he would murder again. He may murder again in prison.
Craig Bjork was born in 1959. His name at birth was Craig Jackson.
Craig Jackson had a really rough childhood. He had an abusive, racist father. There are references of his dad molesting him when he was 7 years old. His dad would beat him pretty brutally. He talks about his dad wanted him to learn to tell time, so he would ask him what time it was, and if he got it wrong, he would punch him.
Abuse can affect the development of the brain. By the age of 4, you are starting to remember and learn and retain everything that your parents or your caregivers are demonstrating. So when your own protector is the one who is engaging in the abuse, that can really scar a child for life, because if you can't trust your own parent, who now can you trust in the world?
Jackson's father was described as an extreme racist and brought his son up in the same belief system.
His dad would scream the N-word on a regular basis, would talk about how he thought black people were destroying America. A big part of, I think, Craig Jackson's childhood was being around that kind of just vitriol racism and absorbing a lot of it himself.
Modeled behavior is probably the best indicator of how a child is going to learn. So if he's watching his father engage in racist and misogynistic behaviors, he's going to normalize that kind of rhetoric and he's going to internalize it.
Jackson's mom eventually left her abusive husband and took her young son to live in cities across the state. But ultimately, they ended up circling back to their hometown of Des Moines.
Craig Jackson was mostly raised by his mom. He talked a lot about his mom being promiscuous. He talked about hearing her having sex with every Tom, Dick, and Harry, as he put it, with only a towel in between them.
Jackson has already been set up for failure in terms of how to properly understand sexual relationships, interpersonal relationships, friendships, parental relationships. Before the time he's even 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, this child has a very, very skewed perception of what relationships actually entail.
As a child, Craig Jackson began to echo his father's violent tendencies.
One time he tied 2 cats' tails together and let them just rip each other apart. He would stamp out flowers. He would fight other kids. I think in 8th grade, he got into a fight that got him kicked out of school. He pushed a teacher and was just rather violent.
It's understandable that he had a lot of anger. The problem is that anger was not addressed. There doesn't seem to have been any treatment or adaptive outlets. And so the anger is only going to build upon itself. Jackson is really a ticking time bomb before the time he's even an adult.
Still a child, Jackson began experimenting with drugs.
He wouldn't even get out of bed, reportedly, at age 14 until he had smoked marijuana. This was on a daily basis. Of course, marijuana, as some say, is a gateway drug. He graduated to amphetamines and a very strong narcotic, PCP.
At one point, he was popping about 50 amphetamine pills a day, drinking up to a quart of whiskey a day. So he became someone who was just a massive drug addict by his late teens.
So the substance abuse was really a maladaptive coping skill that was setting him up for disaster in the long run.
In 1977, at the age of 18, Craig Jackson started a relationship with a young woman called Terry Rice. Almost immediately, Jackson became physically violent towards her.
He'd beat her to the point where she would suffer significant injuries and would have to seek help from local hospitals, and even at one point went to a women's shelter.
It's a very cowardly act to engage in domestic abuse. So it makes you wonder, if you can do this to the people that you supposedly love and are closest to, what can you do to full strangers? What are you capable of doing to anyone?
Terry became pregnant and in 1978 gave birth to their son, Joey. The violence subsides.
It does seem like there was a moment there where things were fairly good between them. After the first child is born, Craig was apparently a very happy father. He would go around showing everybody his young son and say, I should charge you money to see this beautiful child.
Craig and Terry married in 1979 and moved to Minneapolis.
So Minneapolis in the early 80s in particular was considered this really safe, mid-sized to major American city. The murder rate was very low. We were still 5 or so years away from having the emergence of the kind of gang activity that we were seeing in places like Chicago and New York City. And people just generally thought that Minneapolis was a city that didn't have those kinds of problems.
A year later, the couple had a second child, Jason.
After a second child was born, the abuse became more intense. You know, he had a 1- and 3-year-old, and being around them, he said, just made him really angry.
While he may have been in this pseudo honeymoon phase, that quickly dissipates when he realizes that 2 children and a wife requires a lot of work and a lot of selflessness, which he's incapable of providing. Abuse was really all he knew. It was all he had learned as a child. That being said, he's now an adult and he is responsible for his actions.
Jackson's wife, Terry, was always the main victim of his abuse.
This made things a lot harder because she felt like she couldn't leave Craig Jackson because he had, access to their kids. So by leaving, she would be putting their lives in danger as well. She did leave him several times, but she always came back.
In 1981, Terry suddenly disappeared.
Craig Jackson takes the family to Las Vegas to see his father, and when he returns, he's got Joey and Jason, but Terry isn't with him anymore.
When people would ask Jackson about the whereabouts of Terry, he would usually provide the same response, saying that they were having relationship difficulties, that she had gone back to Des Moines to be with family, to give them some time apart.
Jackson did not appear to miss his wife and mother of his children, as he quickly found himself a new girlfriend.
Jackson is now in his early 20s and he's developed a pattern now. It's almost akin to hunting. He's so predatory in nature that what he does is he goes out to the world, goes to bars, and he essentially finds his next victim, and that's where he met his next girlfriend, Ramona.
Ramona Yerku was a 19-year-old girl who graduated high school in 1980. She was very well liked in high school. She was a member of the school cheer squad. She participated in several plays. She was even on the student government. And at that time, she was working at a local pizzeria.
Ramona's affection towards Craig was repaid with violence.
The relationship was very violent, very abusive. I think he was ramping up actually from Terry. He beat her several times, sending her to the hospital. He was really angry. He was angry at the kids. He was angry at Ramona, and he was really ramping up his drug use around this time too.
It's only making the psychopathic traits worse. It's going to make him more impulsive. It's going to further his ability to manipulate because there's really nothing holding him back.
Ramona did not leave Craig Jackson, despite people telling her to. I think in large part because she fell in love with these kids who were very young at the time.
Ramona seems to be an empathic, caring, loving, well-rounded person, and he's aware that Ramona is attached to his 2 sons. And so he's using his sons as bait in order to keep Ramona stuck in this abusive relationship.
On the afternoon of March 6, 1982, Jackson dropped off his kids at a babysitter and headed to downtown Minneapolis. He visited several bars, getting both drunk and high.
Hennepin Avenue is sort of the heart of downtown Minneapolis's bar and restaurant district. In the 80s, it was sort of known as kind of a seedy place. There were some nightclubs, there were places where you would have, people who were like considered day drinkers who'd spend full days at these bars. He meets a woman named Gwendolyn Johnson. Gwendolyn is a young woman. She's about 20 years old. She's got 2 kids. One thing that's significant about Gwendolyn is that she's a black woman. Craig was sort of a pretty unapologetic racist at this time. He talked about his hatred for black people frequently.
He brought Gwendolyn Johnson back to this house. They had sex consensually, and during the act, he choked her to death.
Strangulation is a very personal way to murder somebody. It requires close, upfront contact. There's no distance involved, and typically speaking, it takes time for people to die through strangulation.
He hid Gwendolyn's body underneath his child's bed.
He takes some of her belongings and puts them in the basement of his apartment. He burns her ID. So there's some acknowledgement there, I think, that he knew what he was doing and that he was trying to cover it up.
He doesn't view her as a human. He views her as a prop, as a tool. He picked her up, he got what he wanted from her, which was sexual gratification, and then he had no need for her anymore.
The next day, March 7th, he picked up his sons from the babysitter.
The babysitter notices he's got some scratches, some kind of defensive wounds on his face. She's a little bit concerned, but all the same, he takes the kids back and is just hanging out with them in the apartment where there was a body hidden under a bed.
Later that day, Jackson put his sons to bed. After finishing her shift at the pizzeria, Ramona went over to his house.
They're smoking weed together, and she's getting ready to leave, and he decides that he's gonna choke her to death. He wraps his hands around Ramona's throat and chokes her until she dies.
Once he's killed the first victim, it's easy for him to continue going on. Why stop? He's probably filled with adrenaline. He's probably realized, I can do this. He's probably getting some kind of gratification from it. And so it's just like any other addiction. He just continues to do it because it feels good and it serves him.
Jackson then walked into the room where his 2 sons, age 1 and 3, were sleeping.
He decides that God wants him to choke them to death and send them to heaven. Joey is sleeping on the bed with Gwendolyn Johnson's body underneath it. He chokes them both to death. He describes it later as saying there was no big incident, it was very peaceful, and he was just sending everyone to heaven.
Murdering his children and his girlfriend is the ultimate control. I mean, when you dictate when and how somebody dies, there is no other level of control. Those were the easiest, most vulnerable targets. They were closest to him, and they were just a means to an end.
Jackson spent the rest of the night at home, getting high, with 4 dead bodies lying just meters away.
Ramona Yurku was missing for several days, and her family, knowing that she was in a very abusive relationship with Jackson, became concerned about her. They contacted the local police department. The police department went to Jackson's residence. However, they found that Jackson was not home.
Minneapolis police showed up here looking for Ramona Yurku, and they found 4 dead bodies. It was a really grisly murder scene that I don't think anyone expected when they walked in the door.
Ramona's father was interviewed at the time, telling reporters how he learned what had happened.
It was a doorbell. and a man in the suit, plainclothes suit, identified himself as a chaplain, police chaplain from Minneapolis. I said, "She's dead, isn't she?" He said, "Yes." And I said, "The kids too?" And he said, "Yes."
Nothing's more impactful than the death of children. The first thing is complete shock and sadness. It's very painful, and those are visions in your brain that will be imprinted indefinitely. I would immediately suspect the father. On a homicide scene where there's 2 dead children, a dead girlfriend, and a 4th body, and the missing component is the father, absolutely, he would be the primary suspect.
Well, what it boils down to is she gave her life for those babies. It's as simple as that. She stayed there knowing she was in danger, but she wanted to protect those babies.
This was really described in the newspapers as like the murder of the century. It was sort of a house of horrors, walking into there. The newspapers described this as a vile and extremely grim scene.
A murder investigation was immediately launched. It was quickly determined that all 4 victims had been manually strangled, and the main suspect was Craig Jackson. He had fled the state and was on the run. For a month, he went undetected. Then, on the morning of April 8th, he called the police from a restaurant in Wichita, Kansas.
Jackson contacted the lead detective and stated that he wanted to surrender. When law enforcement arrived, Jackson was just in the back of the restaurant using a phone booth. Jackson provided no resistance and even made a comment similar to, "I'm not going to give you guys any trouble."
Jackson was brought back to Minnesota and charged with the homicides of Gwendolyn Johnson, Ramona Yurku, and his sons, Joey and Jason. Whilst Jackson was in custody, another body was found.
About a month after Craig Jackson turns himself in Wichita, Kansas, there is a father and son in rural Iowa foraging for mushrooms, and they find what is at this point basically skeletal remains of what turns out to be Terry, Craig Jackson's wife.
Terry had been found dead, and it was believed she was dead up to 18 months. Jackson denied killing her.
Police thought otherwise and charged Jackson with his wife's murder. After being deemed mentally competent to stand trial, on October 18, 1982, the proceedings began for the first 4 homicides.
He pleads not guilty by reason of insanity. The murders of Craig Jackson was a national news story. I think people were horrified. There was a lot of interest in seeing him held accountable. So the fact that his defense was arguing this insanity plea, I think a lot of people didn't want him to be able to get away with it.
Jackson flippantly saying that he was sending everyone to heaven as if it was a mercy killing, to me, is just a load of bull. I don't buy any of it. It's a way for him to control his image, control the narrative, manipulate other people, have the world believe that he isn't the person who he thinks he is.
On November 4th, the jury reached a guilty verdict on all counts.
Jackson received 3 life sentences, plus 20 years for second-degree murder, for the murder of Gwendolyn Johnson.
And the judge renders his opinion by saying, "This is one of the most heinous and evil acts that I've ever encountered in the criminal justice system. And this sentence is to make sure that you never walk free again."
Even though Jackson was behind bars, the path of death and destruction would not be over.
Despite being charged with the murder of his wife, Terry Rice, it never went to court. quadruple murderer Craig Jackson was sent to Oak Park Heights Penitentiary, Minnesota's newest prison at the time. But this was only half the story. As violent as he was outside prison, once inside, he became one of the world's most dangerous prisoners.
Back when I started in '82, Oak Park Heights was built as the Supermax. It was built pretty elaborate. Most of the units were 52-man housing units. Each inmate got to have their own private room. They brought in the worst of the worst around the United States. We also were housing federal inmates, and they brought them to us because they couldn't handle them in their facilities. It was a wild, wild west.
My name is Jamie Morgan Kane, and I served 34 and a half years in California prisons. In the 80s, it was a lot harder than it has become. You were restricted on things you could have. Movements were a lot tougher. It was more punishment than rehabilitation. You could be assaulted, could be stabbed. And brutality was something that came in droves from both staff and inmates at any given time.
Every day you go to work, you didn't know if you were going to have your shirt tore off or not, or come home with a black eye.
Death was cheap. I mean, I watched a person be killed over a single pack of tobacco.
Craig Jackson is first incarcerated at Oak Park Heights Prison, and he is a problem from the beginning. There's a lot of drugs in prison. So he's continuing to do drugs. He's fighting a lot. He's making a lot of problems. And when he gets caught, he basically says, "What are you gonna do? I'm already facing multiple life sentences."
His room was always clean. His appearance was always clean. Once in a great while, he had an issue. And whether it was threatening staff or whether it was threatening another inmate, he would go to segregation for that. 75 days later, he'd come back out, and then you wouldn't hear a peep out of him again for quite some time.
If you were a child killer, you would have to be separated from the main lines because the guys would try to get you. They would try to slash you up. They would try to stab you. They'd try to cripple you. They didn't necessarily want to kill them. They wanted them to suffer. It was basically an open contract. And everybody in the prison knew if you had a chance and you didn't take it on doing something to one of them, then you could become a target because they'd assume you had some kind of like to the guy. You don't want to be a friend of a child killer.
Because he had killed 2 young kids, his reputation in prison was notorious. Some of them called him the family killer.
In 1991, after 9 years in prison, Craig Jackson, now 32, decided that it was time to change his identity.
The state started paying for name changes. And once the inmates got a hold of, hey, we can get our names changed and the DOC is going to pay for it, everybody started changing their names. Craig Jackson became Craig Bjork.
He said that the reason he changed his name is because he just didn't even want to be associated with that version of himself anymore. He didn't want to be the person who was known by some inmates as the family killer. So he changed his name to Craig Bjork for, I guess, sort of a fresh start.
I don't particularly buy that. I think that it was another attention-seeking ploy. He's displayed narcissistic traits and a huge ego his entire life. So it was all, what we call impression management, trying to control the narrative, trying to control the way he's viewed. People who actually change don't have to announce it to the world. They just do it.
We're currently at the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Stillwater in Bayport, Minnesota. The prison was built, I think, in 1914. Stillwater Prison, I think, currently houses 1,700 offenders.
Stillwater Prison lies a couple of miles away from Oak Park Heights.
Kind of an overflow of Oak Park Heights. They got like 7 housing facilities inside. The average bed space is like 250 per cell block. At Stillwater Prison, there's everything from child molesters to killers to arsonists to burglars. We had cop killers in there. We had people who killed their wives and put them in a garbage disposaler.
In the 1990s, after being promoted to investigator for the Department of Corrections, Dave was assigned to Stillwater.
When I first came in there, first thing I noticed how loud it was. It doesn't have air conditioning. It stunk. You know, that many inmates, and some of them don't bathe. The people who didn't like their hygiene usually got their asses kicked.
So in the mid-90s, Craig Bjork has moved to Stillwater Prison, and he really doesn't want to be there. He doesn't like his cell location. He doesn't like the facility. And he says, you know, I really want to be moved back to Oak Park Heights.
After over a decade behind bars, Craig Bjork, now aged 37, was placed within general population at Stillwater Prison.
In 1996, Craig Bjork sent a letter to the warden here at MCF Stillwater claiming that if he didn't get moved over back to Oak Park Heights, he was going to start killing staff and inmates.
He's basically saying, I'm gonna go on a murder spree if I don't get what I want. He's evaluated by a prison psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist comes back and says, he's serious. And they keep him in general population, and I think it's a fair question of whether or not they really took those threats as seriously as they should have.
You're in prison now for having killed multiple people. You don't get to pick and choose what happens now. He's not understanding that, or he refuses to understand it.
During the time that Craig Bjork was in MCF Stillwater, he was assigned to work in the kitchen. He was in charge of cleaning the recycling containers and also taking out the garbage and stuff like that.
Generally, the rule of thumb is if you are able-bodied, you have to work. In the butcher shops we used to have, most of the free staff butchers would not hire you unless you are either a killer or somebody who was an extremely violent person assaulting with knives and sharp implements. And there were guys who were burglars that went for jobs, and the guy goes, you ever killed anybody? No. Well, I only hire killers. Because the idea was that you didn't have a problem with blood and all the other stuff.
Despite his threats of violence, Bjork was still allowed to keep his job in the kitchen, where in 1997, he worked alongside convicted sex offender Edwin Curry.
Edwin Curry had at least 6 months left on his sentence before he was going to be released.
It was Thanksgiving Day. Edwin Curry and Craig Bjork were both working in the kitchen that day. Craig Bjork has this 3 foot of pipe that he's been hiding, and he goes up behind Edwin Curry.
He hit Edwin Curry about 8 times on the top of the head, back of the neck, and then he finally broke his windpipe, and that's what caused Mr. Curry's death.
This wasn't like a shank where he slit his throat and it was quick. This was a slow beating of a man, you know, pummeling his head, crushing his windpipe. This was a very violent killing.
After the murder, an officer walked in to find Craig Bjork in the kitchen.
He immediately saw Bjork attempting to clean up a red liquid by washing it away with a hose. And the correctional officer questioned what was happening. Bjork stated that he was cleaning up the mess from some beet cans. At that point, Bjork said he had to go and left the area.
The officer suddenly realized that the huge pool of red liquid was blood.
The corrections officer realizes that these are drag marks in the blood and follows them to the garbage closet and finds Edwin Curry's body wrapped in plastic wrap in the garbage cart. Immediately, calls this in. The guards go looking for Craig Bjork, and they find him in the cafeteria eating a candy bar and drinking a glass of milk.
It was premeditated, it was calculated, he planned it, he did it, and then he went back to eating a candy bar and drinking milk. That is how Bjork views murder. It's just another event in his life.
Special Investigator Dave Campa was immediately called in to the prison.
I received a call from home and said that there was a homicide at the prison. About 30 minutes later, I arrived and I found a whole bunch of police people here, ambulances here, other investigators that came to assist.
I've never seen that much blood in my life. It was covered every square inch of that room. Curry's body was in a fetal position when the staff, Sergeant Schwartz, found him.
Edwin Curry was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wasn't mad at Edwin Curry, he was mad at the prison officials for ignoring him. He just wanted to make good on the threat that he had sent, saying that if they didn't move him, he was going to kill somebody.
He was saying he was going to do this, and I think that by doing it on Thanksgiving, when administration and all these people are at home, they would all have to come in, and that way he could say to them, "I told you so."
The guard testified later that he started telling him, "Hey, it's a good thing you caught me when you did, because I was going to kill a bunch more people."
This murder was pointless. There was no self-defense. There wasn't even an argument that had occurred. There was no lead-up. It was a senseless taking of a life for a sociopathic narcissist who just wanted to make a point to the prison system.
When the guards searched his cell, they found a journal with an entry for that day, and he had written them a little note that said, "You should have moved me, punks."
After the murder of Edwin Curry, Bjork was immediately transferred back to Oak Park Heights.
He got what he wanted. He wanted to go to Oak Park Heights. And what he had to do, he did it, just to show the administration that you didn't listen to me and you need to start listening to people from now on.
On March 8, 1999, Bjork was convicted of first and second-degree murder in the killing of Edwin Curry.
The judge renders another life sentence for Craig Bjork to run consecutively with the 3 he's already serving. So by this stage, Craig Bjork is convicted of killing 5 people. 4 of those he's now serving life sentences for, plus another 20 years for the 5th one.
In January 2013, over a decade since the murder of Edwin Curry, Bjork was transferred to Oregon State Penitentiary.
Notably, this is against his will. He described it as he was kidnapped. He was kidnapped and brought to this prison in Oregon.
This was done through a interstate exchange agreement between prisons, which allows prisons to essentially transfer or swap inmates that may be having security issues or they have high-profile crimes.
Bjork, age 53, was placed into a shared cell with 45-year-old Joe Akins.
Joe Akins is also a convicted murderer. He was convicted in 2008 of a crime he committed in 1984, which entailed raping and murdering a woman. He was serving a 22-year sentence.
Craig Bjork had stated that he was sober and he was no longer doing drugs while in prison, and additionally had almost no disciplinary history, essentially described himself as a model inmate. That's the speculation as to why he received and was allowed a cellmate.
The prison system there was pretty stupid to put another inmate in the same cell with him. And I said, well, that was probably one of the dumbest mistakes they've ever made.
On August 17, 2013, Bjork confronted Akins, accusing him of hiding weapons and drugs in their cell.
Bjork took issue with that because he felt that if it was found, they would both be blamed. Now, later that same night, Bjork stated he was attacked by Akins in his sleep. At that point, he defended himself.
He holds Akins down on the bed. He grabs this apparatus that was made of shoelaces and belts to keep the pillow on the bed. And he grabs this apparatus and wraps it around Akins's neck, and he chokes him to death. And what he described is self-defense.
In prison, there is no self-defense. It's called mutual combat. There is either defense or non-defense. In some cases, it's sometimes better to make your defense become offensive. You're taking the person off their being the aggressor and making them have to now defend themselves, and it just changes the parameters.
When his cell opened, he just left, went out to the chow hall for breakfast like all the other inmates.
After breakfast, Bjork went up to an officer in the yard and admitted what he had done.
He was just very calm and matter of fact, and that's kind of why he had to convince me, because it was just a normal conversation, normal tone of voice. Hey, I can't get back to my cell. My cell is dead. He didn't appear to be in any kind of distress about it. He was perfectly fine with it.
Bjork was charged with his 6th murder, and because he was now in an Oregon prison, found himself facing the death penalty.
I reached out to him, seeing if he wanted to talk for the article, and he said, the death penalty is vengeance. And isn't that more evil than anything that I've ever done? For the government to say, we're going to kill you in revenge for what you've done.
However, by chance, while he was awaiting trial, the governor at the time abolished the death penalty in the state of Oregon. And just like that, Bjork's no longer facing the death penalty.
On December 23rd, 2019, Bjork, now age 60, pleaded no contest to the charges against him.
In other words, he's saying, I don't really have an adequate defense to this. So he was sentenced to yet another life sentence. So Craig Bjork is now convicted of killing 6 individuals, and he's facing at least 5 life sentences. Is this more of a punishment? Only on paper, I think. It's not really practically, doesn't really change the situation that much.
In my experience, more than 70% of inmates have no desire to rehabilitate. And this can be for a number of reasons. Some of them feel if they rehabilitate, they lose their street cred. But part of it is also they don't see a reason to put the effort in to rehabilitate. Person has to want to do it.
The prosecutor said that this is a grave injustice. He says that Craig Bjork is someone who is the worst of the worst, and that's what the death penalty should be for. This is somebody who's been convicted of killing men, women, and child, plural. He should be the poster child for the death penalty.
In 2021, Bjork was transferred to AdMax USP Florence in Colorado, the most secure prison in the United States.
What do you do with prisoners like Craig Bjork? I think it poses a real problem for prisons and for lawmakers and for society. There's really not a lot of reason to think about rehabilitating him because he's never gonna get out.
At minimum, I would say he needs to be completely and absolutely segregated from any human contact. Inmates completely, and only officers when it is absolutely necessary.
I think that you give him an opportunity again to kill somebody, he will. I think he enjoys it.
I think it'd be naive to say there's no way this guy is going to kill anybody again. I think he's proven that he is capable of it, though.
This is not a person who will stop murdering. I mean, as evidenced by the fact that not only did he murder multiple times in the community, he murdered in prison.
Nobody is safe from this monster. If you can kill your own children, you are capable of the rawest evil and violence on the planet, and you are irredeemable.